Hello, and thanks very much for coming along to this presentation. This one's called Redefining Leadership, the Modern CISO in a Business-First AI and Cloud-centric World. But what does that mean? What am I going to get out of this presentation in the next 30 minutes? So firstly, I'm going to be talking about where we've come from. I always think it's helpful to have a brief history of the evolving role of the CISO. Gives us some context. Secondly, where we're going to, the evolving landscape and the importance of having a strategic vision for the benefits and adversities from new technologies such as AI and cloud. And finally, what you need to know so that you can be prepared for the huge change in the evolving landscape of cybersecurity. For example, the new legislation that requires boards to disclose that they have members that have cybersecurity expertise, as well as recent cases where such members have actually faced legal ramifications. First of all, I just want to say hello. My name is Alistair Ross. I've got about 2 decades of information security and technology experience. Yes, that makes me old. So I saw the CISO role from when it pretty much started till today. I'm currently the Chief Executive Officer and founder of Revolution InfoSec. I'm previously the Director of Cybersecurity for Cognizant New Zealand, and previous to that, I was the CISO for Solnet Group. I'm passionate about reducing organizational risk, and that's really the genesis of what I do within Revolution InfoSec. And secretly, I'm a geek at heart. I started out on Unix systems and Linux systems in the 1990s. I worked for Amazon and GE, kind of doing that stuff. Love automation, doing scripts way before it was called DevOps, that sort of stuff. And I also run a YouTube channel which is all about really geeky things. So yeah, I've grown up with technology, but you'll see in a moment where you'll find that technology is just a tool, and actually as a CISO, it's really important to understand what technology brings, but also what the human element to being a CISO is all about. It's very, very important. So anyway, what does the term CISO mean to you? Well, I'm going to say that the CISO is responsible for these things. Now, 2 things. This is my opinion. Obviously, other people have different opinions, but hopefully I'm pretty much on the money here. And secondly, note that I've underscored the word responsible. Now, I'm going to come back to that in a bit because the term responsible here, there's also other words that could be used, especially in the developing landscape of the CISO. Now, first thing that the CISO is responsible for is general governance of the policy and the processes of cybersecurity within an organization. But that extends further, and there are more things to it than just the governance. Governance means a lot of things to a lot of people, but I won't dwell on that for now. Just basically remember that everything cybersecurity really has, you as the CISO have the responsibility for looking after it for an organization. You obviously have a team, hopefully, of people who work with you, and they may be very technical people, for example. The other aspect to it is developing and potentially implementing the security strategy. That includes risk prevention, assessments, incident response, security controls, training, and organizational culture. So it's all fair and well, for example, developing a cybersecurity incident response playbook, but if you can't get the organization themselves to understand why it's important to have that policy in place and actually coach the people throughout that policy, I'm just picking on that policy for an example, but if you can't coach people and help them understand why it's an important thing to have, then of course all of that effort built on that, making that policy, is for naught. So that's one area that is just an example of why it's really important to have both aspects there, and I'll come back to that in a while. Another aspect is budget. It's really important to understand how important the budget is, and we're talking here about an evolving landscape of cybersecurity, and we can see every year there's a massive tangential change in the organizational requirements of cybersecurity. Never before has cybersecurity been such a big deal. And therefore, sorting a budget out which is any further out than, say, 12 months is actually going to be a really, really hard thing. So if you're a CEO and you're watching this and you give your CISO a very hard time because he or she can't work out the budget accurately, and you're asking for projections further than 12 months, go easy on them. It's a very, very difficult thing to sort out. And in fact, I would probably argue that you probably don't want any more than a 12-month budget forecast for cybersecurity. The next thing is you need to be working with the board to advise on areas of risk. And I'm going to come back to this particular point in just a few moments. I think this one's very, very important. And then there's managing the information security team. Obviously, a CISO does not do security on his or her own. You likely work with a team. Now, if it's a smaller organization, that team might just be the IT team. But if it's a larger organization, hopefully you have a dedicated cyber security team to respond with. And of course, there's much, much more. It's an ever-growing role, and there's lots and lots of things to get talking about. But basically, it's a very stressful job. And I'm going to talk about the stress aspect of the job in a moment as well. So let's have a brief history of the CISO. Let's find out where this role has come from and what's led us to where we are today. I always think that a bit of the backstory really helps people understand why and how the role began. So the very first CISO that was ever mentioned was a person called Steve Katz, and he was hired by the Citigroup. I think it was called Citicorp at the time, so the banking company. And that was following a series of attacks from Russian hackers, and that was all the way back in 1994, so a long, long time ago now. So back then, CISOs were often not part of the board, which is really interesting. And think in this case of the Citicorp, I think Steve Katz probably was part of the board. But, you know, at the time, CISOs were often technology focused. And so they were often seen as these sort of geeks, and they were kind of talking what I like to call ones and zeros. They weren't often talking plain English, and that created a problem. Now, we'll talk about that in a bit more time as well. Back then, you know, in the mid to late 90s and well into the noughties, all infrastructure pretty much was either on-premise or in a data center, okay? Think about that. You know, we've seen a massive shift in where we have our infrastructure and what we call infrastructure today. Software, if you remember, they were in big cardboard boxes, right? They had CD-ROMs, maybe even floppy disks inside them, right? You know, hands up, who can remember floppy disks? It's that long ago that we started this journey into taking cybersecurity seriously, all right? And so these days we consume most of the software that we use as a service. Back then, a lot of it wasn't, most of it wasn't. And then obviously we have these things that started off, perhaps some would have said as buzzwords, but really as we've seen over time, that's no longer the case. So things like AI, DevSecOps, and the Internet of Things, they really weren't a thing back in 1994 especially. So these have evolved very rapidly in the last sort of 10 years or so. And staff, this is a big difference. They were mainly in offices. How many remote workers were in your offices in the sort of turn of the millennia? And maybe even in 2010, as recently as the 10s, you know, how many staff were working remotely? Not many. And then finally, I think this one is perhaps contentious, of course, but why not? I'll just put this out there. Security was often seen as a barrier. I remember working in a particular organization where you weren't allowed to visit specific sites. And these weren't dodgy sites. These were sites like yahoo.com, right? They just decided, security had decided, no, we're going to put up this proxy, and this would say you can visit these specific sites, very limited subset of websites, but everything else is blocked. Now, of course, if you were like me and you enjoyed tinkering with IT systems, of course, you would find your way around these systems. So that created a new problem for those people who could tinker and probably tell their friends, this is the way round the back door to get what you want. So back then, it was very much a barrier and not an enabler. And this is from an organizational perspective, a cultural perspective. Very different, hopefully, to what we have today. So that's the history of the CISO. What has changed? Well, almost everything, I'd argue. So today, CISOs almost always are part of the board. Now, if you aren't part of the board and you're in a CISO role, then ask yourself why, and ask yourself if that's something that you should perhaps be looking into. Now, I would say that the importance of the CISO is to ensure that you are talking about business outcomes and strategic aspects, not just technology, or in fact, perhaps not technology at all. We'll come back to that. Infrastructure, pretty much these days, is cloud only, or at least a hybrid cloud type of model. Software is often outsourced, it's a subscription model, it's as a service. AI is becoming much more prevalent and it's opening up new risks as it does so, and we'll talk about that later on. And remote work is huge. Here's some figures from Forbes. 28.2% of staff work in a hybrid fashion and 12.2% work full-time remote. Now that is a massive change, especially over the last sort of 3 or 4 years. Obviously, COVID was a major catalyst to this, but it just goes to show that we have technology in place and we have people who, now that they've seen the ability to work remotely and organizational change has allowed this to continue following COVID, there's a real change, and we must understand that the perimeter of what we used to have, that old moat and castle kind of setup where we had this big firewall that said, that's us, we're okay inside this firewall, all of our devices are inside here, and everything outside on the internet, that's bad, so we put this big firewall. That model, the perimeter, is no longer the case. It's everywhere. All of our technology is all over the place. It's no longer just in one place. And our staff also aren't just in one place. And of course, as I said, DevSecOps and IoT, the Internet of Things, they are everywhere. They're two very different things, but basically, I have a washing machine, and that washing machine, for some reason, I can switch that on and use it from anywhere. Now, quite why I would want to switch my washing machine on when I'm, down the road speaking with friends, I don't know why I would particularly want to do that, because obviously I need to fill the washing machine first, but there you go. I can connect to my washing machine over the internet and switch it on, or find other statistics out about my washing machine. There are particular problems with that sort of a thing, as I'll touch on in just a minute. And finally, obviously I said earlier on, and perhaps you can argue this point, but I've put here with a question mark against it, security can be seen as an enabler. All right. And I'll just touch on phishing as well. Phishing is something, if you think back to, the days of, early noughties or even 2010 or something like that, yes, you would get spam and it was annoying and some people fell for it. There was a lot of Nigerian princes asking you for their help back in 2010. But certainly the world of spam evolved into the world of phishing, and that is a huge, huge problem. So today it's really, really big business. Phishing is the single most common form of cybercrime, and the advancement in technology such as AI has made massive improvements to the success rates of attacks. Now just look at these figures here. So we're talking recent history here. 2019, there was 779,000 successful phishing attacks. All right, it's a big number, but look at the year after. 2020, we had 1.845 million successful phishing attacks. Then the following year, 2.8. And then last year, 4.7 million successful phishing attacks. This is a massive, massive epidemic. 3.4 billion cyber attack emails are now sent per day. That's 1 trillion phishing emails every single year. Massive numbers. And 36% of all data breaches involve phishing. So if you're not doing something about phishing, which I'm sure you are, there is a massive element to what we do in the world of cybersecurity today. So every CISO needs to have a plan of what to do with regards to phishing. That's one big area on its own. And there's another nice statistic. 17.8% is the average click rate now. 53.2% for spear phishing. Now, these spear phishing campaigns are extremely complex and very well made. So big change these days. All right, so we've seen the history, we've seen where we are today, but let's go a little bit deeper into that and unpack some of those changes. So let's just start with the one that I said about CISOs being part of the board. Now, I think I mentioned a moment ago, you should be reporting to the CEO or at least the board. But if you're not reporting to the CEO, ask yourself, if not, why not? Now, if you're reporting to the CIO or CTO, ask yourself, are there difficulties in this relationship? According to Harvard Business Review, only 69% of board members see eye to eye with CISOs. That's not a great number. So think about your relationship. Try and detach yourself as well from your own ego and your own pride, and just think about the people that you interact with at the boardroom and find out what they really might think about you. Now, this same study, the Harvard Business Review one, went on to find that 65% of board members vetted think that they're at risk of a material cyber attack, but only 48% of CISOs share that view. Now, what's going on there? That's a really interesting statistic. Is it that CISOs believe they're better prepared and that the information that they've passed to the board, the message isn't quite getting through? What's going on there? So use those statistics and arm yourself with that. When you go back to the office or working remote, wherever you are, try and figure out where that disconnect is. Really try and get to that. Maybe even ask the question of the board straight out. That's a really interesting statistic, I think. But more importantly, I think it all comes down to relationships. You need to nurture a solid relationship with your board members. Now, maybe if the favorite thing of the CEO is baking cakes or playing golf, I'm not suggesting that you go off to the golf course or bake cakes with the CEO, but just try and understand what makes that individual tick. Try and get personal with them so that you can establish a better level of trust, because cybersecurity and trust goes hand in hand after all. So it's really important that you get to know your board members very well, because once you've got that sort of rapport, having conversations about cybersecurity and what is necessity is a very, very difficult conversation. But if you know them a bit better, it makes it that bit easier. They'll trust what you're going to say. So try and understand what they do outside of their role and talk to them on a personal level. You'll find things go a lot easier then. Now, obviously, once you've established that level of trust and the strength in the relationship, it's then that you can start to build a culture of cybersecurity throughout the organization. So again, it's all about these relationships and the trickle-down effect that might have, because the CEOs, the CIOs, the CTOs might not understand the full ramifications of having a culture of cybersecurity. Education, education, education. All right, this next one, it's very important for a CISO to understand their duty to keep it business, at the board especially, and not tech. Now, back in the day, as I said before, the CISO was pretty much a tech role, but it's evolved massively. So if you're still having conversations at the board level about firewalls and VPNs and other security products, then perhaps you need to change your dialogue. Now, CISOs should be talking about business risk, governance, budget, and that's the sort of conversation you should be having with the board. It's pivotal in building a culture of cybersecurity at all levels of the business, but starting at the board is pretty much the best place to start. Now, a CISO removes the barriers of old, and they turn cybersecurity into an enabler by integrating seamlessly with business operations. So you need to keep the solutions that you have user-friendly and use modern solutions that get out of the way for the end user, not stuff that will pull them back like the SOX proxy I told you about earlier, where it blocked websites all over the place, because people are just going to find ways around the security technologies if that's the sort of way. It's the draconian measure. And also, new roles and new aspects to the role are popping up all the time. For example, a CISO now needs to understand regulatory or compliance changes. And remember, finally, I'll say on this one, that a CISO that talks tech bores the board room. All right? Okay, so as the risks have become higher, so too has the stress. Now, I think this is a very important thing, because if we look at the landscape of CISOs, a lot of them are being asked how stressed out they are. And this role is becoming more and more stressful. In fact, CISOs are leaving the roles. So again, going back to that conversation I had about the boardroom, having a conversation with your peers on the board to say, whoa, this is a really stressful job, and this is why. It's an important conversation, because if they don't understand why it's a stressful job, then they can't provide any assistance. So having that conversation and being honest, I think, is a really important thing to do. But it seems these days that CISOs need to be experts on insurance, legal ramifications, regulatory compliance, reputational protection, and so many more things. In fact, the executive search firm Heidrick & Struggles shows the most significant personal risks that CISOs are facing in their roles are stress at 59% and burnout at 48%. It's a really, really stressful job. And that makes us... It's like this every single day. Hands up who feels that way in their CISO role. Now, I said before that CISOs are responsible, but nowadays they're also being culpable. And that's a very recent change, really. They're becoming increasingly vulnerable to legal ramifications and even criminal charges. In May 2023, Joe Sullivan, the former CISO of Uber, was sentenced to 3 years of probation for concealing a 2016 breach. In June of this year, the CISO of SolarWinds received a Wells notice from the SEC. That's a formal notification alerting them of potential enforcement actions. And then finally, of July of this year, every US-based business is now required to report material breaches within 48 hours to the SEC, and similar privacy stipulations are starting to come up all over the world. So, let's talk about infrastructure, where we were back in the day. And you can see this happy fellow over there in 2003 and maybe before that as well. That's kind of like what your server room looked like. Everybody had a server room, right? Some people had them off-site in a co-location data center. Some people had them on-prem. But that's what it kind of looked like. Fast forward to 2023 and everything's in the cloud, as you can see from this picture here. Now, if you think about it, AWS got going in about 2006, but it wasn't until about 2010 that cloud computing really started to take off. In the last 13 years, we've seen massive changes in the way that organizations consume infrastructure. We either used hardware in our own server rooms or co-located it in data centers, as I said. Nowadays, the thought of having a dedicated server seems very antiquated, and although that might be using a virtual machine, it's still a big step back. Virtual machines like EC2 is still common, but the use of microservices have really changed the way we think about compute. Pre-cloud days, we'd think about operating systems permissions. We're thinking about IAC and IAM roles these days. Completely different things to think about. And all these microservices, all of them are controlled by infrastructure as code. It's a completely different world. So nowadays we have multiple cloud platforms and multiple SaaS solutions. You don't control those products. They're controlled by the provider, the vendor, right? So when we have this, it's a completely different shift to how we deal with these in our organizations. In the old days, the IT team could control the products in use. And now all you need to get these products is a credit card to deploy them. And this topic on its own is huge, and I don't unfortunately have enough time to talk about it today, but in short, having organizational privacy, security and compliance controls across the entire vendor supply chain is a task that's constantly evolving, and you need to ensure that your asset and risk register is as evolved as the technology that your organization utilizes. You can't think of the term shadow IT anymore. It just doesn't exist. It is IT, and you need to embrace this while still providing a safe way for your staff to adopt these technologies with the knowledge of the IT team so they can put them into their own controls and registers. Okay, next up is AI. Now, if your organization's not looking into AI from a holistic perspective, then you might have bigger problems than just cybersecurity. Unfortunately or fortunately, AI is not going away. It's not a buzzword. But from a cyber perspective, AI is both an adversary and also a useful assistant. Let's just have a look at some helpful statistics on the topic. 60% of organizations already use generative AI, such as OpenAI's ChatGPT. However, only 41% of those organizations have a standard policy and usage approach to AI. Now, that is concerning. And of course, as I said earlier on, banning things is a draconian measure. So simply banning the ChatGPT website is not going to be the answer. People will find ways around it. The best approach is to educate your staff as to how to use it, but also what the side effects are. For example, hallucinations. ChatGPT, if you've typed something in and you've got this very strange answer, that does happen all the time. So you can't say for sure that something is fact. And there's also biases, all sorts of different types of bias. So make sure that you're, again, helping your staff with a culture of using these things appropriately. Some other statistics, 76% of CISOs surveyed are positive or very positive about AI's outlook. And 58% of CISOs believe that AI will augment, improve or automate redundant processes or tasks. Now, if you are one of those CISOs, that's all fair and well, but remember that your workforce may not actually see those statistics as good things. They may be worried about what that means for their jobs. So make sure you have a little bit of empathy, a little bit of sympathy for those workers who you may be changing their roles as a result of these changes with AI. Now, conversely, CISOs are also concerned about the future of AI. Now, LLM's data privacy, large language models, the data privacy already has a track record of being immature. If you recall, a while back, Samsung, some of their employees had a good idea. They thought, well, OpenAI, ChatGPT can help us out, fix a problem with a microcontroller or something like that. So they put their intellectual property into ChatGPT to try and get the answer. Unfortunately, that created a privacy problem. So just that's a perfect example of where a concern might be happening. Now, 23% of CISOs wonder if LLM data privacy is enough to meet organizational standards. Now, just bear in mind that the security of AI is still unproven. For example, ChatGPT and Bard, as well as Copilot, are black boxes. We simply don't know how they work under the hood. So that has its problems, and not surprisingly, 23% of CISOs don't know if ChatGPT and other large language models can be trusted to be secure. 21% also worry about how the workforce will use it. And of course, workforce can use it as good, but also as bad. And sometimes, like the Samsung example, can be unwittingly doing so. 15% of the CISOs worry about the ramifications of bias. And of course, there are many considerations for bias. It's not just a simple thing. AI interpretation, social and ethical concerns, and not to mention legal and regulatory concerns. 15% are concerned about reputation from deepfakes. I think perhaps that should be higher, to be honest with you. Think about a disgruntled ex-employee who posted a deepfake video of your CEO saying something negative about the organization that could harm your reputation. The technology is already good enough to make people believe that those videos are real. And then 3% of other concerns. So, in summary, CISOs need to ensure that they are taking a non-tech approach at the board and creating a culture of cybersecurity throughout their organizations. Infrastructure and software has changed so much that if you don't have up-to-date policies to consider the democratization of these platforms, then you really need to adapt now. Exercise caution with IoT devices. Bear in mind that they're not necessarily inherently secure, and AI is here to stay. You need to plan to adapt for the huge changes ahead with them. Understand the benefits that AI security tools could have, but also understand there's a lot of hype in the market right now. And finally, understand that new legislation regarding CISO's culpability in your country and beyond is on its way. Well, I hope that you've learned something valuable from today and that you can put it towards your career or your digital defense. Thank you very much for watching.